All right, well, here we go. Hi, good morning, good afternoon. It's Fred Jacobs from Jacobs Media here in Detroit, actually, in my office. I've done a number of these from sky clubs and hotel rooms, so it actually is very nice to be home doing this from a more comfortable spot. So hopefully you're in the right place. This is our kind of compilation of everything that we've learned in 14 years of our tech surveys, or as we actually call it internally, Techsurvey's greatest hits. So Techsurvey started back in the 2004-2005 zone, and what you're really going to see today is a bit of a history lesson, really, going back all that time. What an amazing period of time it's been for media and technology. And so we're going to walk through a lot of what we've learned along this incredible journey. You're going to see some pretty weird graphics. They have changed quite a bit over the years, but what you're really going to see is how you connect the dots with data. That's really what this presentation is all about. I'll also have some information later on so that you can still register and sign up for Techsurvey 2019, which feels about a month from right now. So we're excited about that. I should also mention this webinar is being recorded, and if you register for it and you are here, you will automatically be sent a link to the webinar, probably later today, but better chance tomorrow. I also put my Twitter handle down there in the lower left-hand corner of the screen at FN Jacobs, or as some of my clients like to say, at FN Jacobs, but whatever works for you. If you want to run any kind of commentary on Twitter, have at it. The stuff you like, the stuff you don't like, and certainly everything in between. So let's actually get into the good stuff here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about philosophy, about how research is actually used to better understand the environment. I think as I look back at my career in research and then in programming and then consulting, really at heart, I'm a data whisperer. I mean, anybody can sit around and look at graphs and pie charts and tables and spreadsheets, but the key really is how you look at the data and how you interpret it. And really, it's asking that question, what is the data trying to say to us? And how can we build a better understanding of our audience and all these changes that are happening in the world of media that are taking place right before our very eyes? So in the next hour, I'm going to walk you through what we've seen over the years and why we think it's very important to where radio is going. And these are really all the tools that we use here at Jacobs Media and JCAPS to understand the landscape. So I'm going to share all those tools with you today and even give you some insights as to how we have been able to figure some of these things out. As those of you who follow our company or our clients or friends know, we were pretty early into the smartphone movement. JCAPS, our mobile app development company, was actually formed about 100 days after Apple opened the App Store. It was these studies that really lit the lamp for us. Social media was another area that we saw early on here, and we hired Lori Lewis to be our head of social media ahead of the curve. Podcasting, same thing. We saw a lot of the early signs of on-demand audio. Seth Ressler is our in-house expert when it comes to on-demand audio and podcasting. Then there's the connected car. A number of you I know have been to the Dash conferences that we put on in 2013, 14, and 15, and now the entire industry talks cars. It's so important. And then finally, voice, right? We think about it as the Amazon Echo and Google Home, but in fact, it is a bigger landscape known as voice. And many of you also know we are developing skills in particular for the Amazon Echo devices at a side company that we operate called Sonic AI. So when you think about Techsurvey and what you're actually looking at audience-wise, The guy I want you to think about here is Vilfredo Pareto. You've probably never heard of him. He created Pareto's principle, which we actually know as the 80-20 rule. And what he realized in his rural area of Italy was that a small percentage of landowners own the lion's share of the land. And in fact, that's where the 80-20 rule came from, that 20% of a population tends to produce 80% of the results, right? 20% of salespeople tend to produce 80% of sales revenue. 20% of listeners kind of represent about 80% of overall ratings. And that's really where Techsurvey lives. As those of you who are veterans of these presentations or have been stakeholders in Techsurvey in the past know, the sample is largely derived from station email databases, also social media followings as well. So these are not average radio listeners, they are core radio listeners. Our feeling is that if you understand the core, or the 20%, that goes a long way toward really having a great grasp on where your radio station or where your radio company actually fits in. And one of the beauties of our tech surveys is that the samples are just so robust. Last year's tech survey drew in 64,000 plus respondents. I mean, that's big enough to fill the average NFL stadium. And so you think about a stadium like us full of fans, that is to a great degree what Techsurvey is all about. So there's strength in numbers, and you see that here in Techsurvey. So we're about to launch 2019 early next year, as I mentioned before. We've done these now for 14, 15 straight years. About a decade or so ago, we started doing companion studies in public radio, and about a half a dozen years ago, we actually broke Christian radio out of our regular Techsurvey and gave them their own study. So we really have a tremendous vantage point here of being able to look at huge numbers of radio listeners and understand where things are moving. Well, I used to be a program director, and I think about this research, this data from a programming point of view, right? How can we make sure that the data is actionable and actually applies to what we do at our radio stations on a daily basis? So as they say, this really happened. I was the program director of WRIF in Detroit, about a couple of 2-3 short miles away from where I'm sitting right now in that picture upper right. Yep, that's me in the middle of the picture with my programming and promotion staff at a station event. In fact, I think that was the Bob Lowe cruise for those of you who have spent any time in the Detroit area. So when I was programming Riff, my biggest challenge really was just trying to make the radio station sound great. I mean, the year was 1980, 81, 82, 83 in that zone. And really the only thing that I had to account for was the sound coming out of the left and right channels, right? The sound of the radio station. Yeah, we did some merchandising. We did hats and shirts and all that. And I definitely approved a lot of the designs. And like a lot of rock radio stations, we did a number of events throughout the year. So I was very much involved in the planning. But for the most part, what you're looking at was my radio PD life. These were my responsibilities, and that was pretty much it. And that almost burned me out, right? I mean, just trying to focus on running a great radio station, that's a full-time job. But then you think about what today's program directors have to account for. They have to make sure they know what's on the website and that it reflects the brand. They have to also be up to speed on the stream, making sure that a good sounding stream is working at all times. Somebody's got to write these blogs for the website, and that usually is part of the program director's responsibility. Then there's the mobile app, right? And we got to make sure that the app is working properly and is updated and looks great. Of course, we have a lot of listeners on Facebook, so we need to make sure that we are connecting with them in that space. And of course, there are probably secondary and even tertiary social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat that we have to be accountable for. Video, very important, right? That we have video on our websites. We know how viral videos can be. And then, of course, we have to worry about sales and revenue. As a program director, I didn't think about sales hardly at all back in 1981, 82, 83. We had a whole department of salespeople, and I kind of looked at it that it was their responsibility to sell the ratings that I generated. Yeah, a very old school way of looking at things, and today's program directors just can't think that way. Well, then there's the car dashboard, right? We know a ton of listening is happening while people are on the road. How do we look in the dashboard? Are we presenting the right face to drivers? Hey, what's our podcast philosophy and strategy? Who's doing podcasts on the station? We've got to worry about Alexa, right? And who knows what else is around the corner. And so when you look at this overall list of responsibilities that programmers have, I look at Techsurvey as a way for them to help prioritize what are the most important channels, what are the most important platforms to make sure that we've got great content on in order to satisfy and grow with our audience. So that is a big part of what Techsurvey is in fact all about. One of the things that you learn when you start looking at this data is that there is such a thing as category or product leadership. iPhone, obviously a huge leader in the smartphone area here in the States, at times #1, and certainly was the device that first really rocked the smartphone industry. Facebook, no question, it's the big dog, always has been, right? And then, of course, Amazon Alexa, with a huge chunk of the voice smart speaker marketplace. But what we learn in Techsurvey is that leadership doesn't mean permanence at all. In fact, when you think about iPhone, the BlackBerry was dominant well before Steve Jobs and company actually developed their own device. Before Facebook, remember, everybody was on MySpace. And before Google, the #1 search engine on planet Earth, it was Yahoo and Lycos and Netscape. So one of the things you learn when you start looking at this data is that the brands that are sitting on top today may not be on top in a year or 2 or 5. So none of us has a crystal ball. We don't know what's coming. And that's why this kind of data is so important in trying to look around the corner and get a sense for what's going on. That's one of the big benefits of Techsurvey. One of the other big benefits is this whole idea of research as marketing. One of the things we've learned after 15 years of web research, which is what Techsurvey is all about, is that there are large portions of the audience that really appreciate the fact that you go to them and ask them for their opinions about your programming as well as their media habits. That really is another one of those collateral or side benefits to Techsurvey. So let's jump in. Let's go back into the time machine, all the way back to 2005, very first survey. And back in the day, Techsurvey was a rock survey. 53 rock-related stations took part in the very first study, generating almost 20,000 listeners. We knew we were onto something in year 1. But our clientele looked like this, right? A lot of classic rock stations, active mainstream stations, and alternative stations. In the early years, Techsurvey was actually a rock study. And so at the very beginning, we wanted to come up with a graphic representation of a lot of different data points so that people would understand at a glance the overall direction of where Techsurvey actually was. And so Tim Davis, who was our digital guy at that point, came up with the idea of the pyramid. And so you're looking at the very first pyramid that we ever did. A number of you've seen this before. I love to show this because it really does illustrate how things have changed in 14 short years. So you look all the way down at the bottom of the pyramid, And just about everybody in our survey listened to the radio for 1 hour a day or more. Television viewing was not as robust with this sample. 87% of our sample owned a cell phone, that was all. And there really weren't smartphones in a mass way at that time. 84% actually use the internet an hour or more a day. Again, internet use was not as ubiquitous 15 years ago. Wi-Fi wasn't as readily available. We talked about and asked about instant messaging. That was a big deal back then. 4 of every 10 of our respondents played video games at least weekly. A third listened to public radio weekly. A quarter, only 25% of the sample actually used text messaging on a weekly basis or more often. Only a quarter listened to streaming radio. Streaming radio was something that really only tech whizzes really got involved with. Remember, most people were on dial-up back then, and the iPod or MP3 player was still a new device. Only 17% owned one. Satellite radio was around back then, but it was before the Sirius XM merger. Only 7% of our overall sample subscribed to satellite radio. So this is the way things looked back in 2004, 2005. And I can tell you, when I first presented this data, people freaked out. It was like, wow, radio listening competes against a lot of new technology here, from cell phones to texting to streaming to iPods. Wow, this is really an eye-opener. The other big eye-opener in the very first tech survey was this cell phone only finding. We found in Techsurvey that 17% of our overall sample didn't have a landline anymore. They were, as we called them, CPOs, or cell phone only. And you can see the arrow is actually pointing to the 18 to 29-year-old segment, because that was the group that was most likely to have dumped their landlines and made their only phone cell phone only. This started a whole flap with Arbitron, who was the ratings company of record back then. In those early years, they did not survey people who did not have a landline. And as you can see, there's an inherent bias there against the young people in our sample who, in fact, did not have a landline at that time. Here's Tech Survey number 2, 2006. 79 stations took part, generating almost 26,000 responses. And this was right around the time when Howard Stern went to Sirius satellite radio. And you can see the growth spurt here from 2005 to 2006. And when we asked people who didn't have satellite radio, were they likely to subscribe in the coming year, you can see that things started tipping toward Sirius. When we actually asked XM subscribers what was in it for them, what were the main reasons why they subscribed to XM, you can see music channels was number 1. Commercial-free programming came into play, along with the ability to be able to listen to satellite radio while being on the road. When we asked Sirius subscribers the same question, you can really see the impact of Howard Stern on Sirius and ultimately all of satellite radio. But this was a very early indicator that something big was going on in the satellite radio space. So remember the cell phone only question from the year before? Well, of course, we started tracking it. And here's where we really started seeing the impact of cell phone only, especially on the alternative format. The yellow bars are 2005, the red bars are 2006. And so you can see the growth in all formats of rock, but clearly with alternative fans, even more pronounced. And then when you actually looked at it by age, as you can see on the right-hand side, it was 18 to 34s disproportionately being impacted by dumping their landlines, but still not being included in an Arbitron listening survey. All right, well, now we're up to 2007 and Tech Survey number 3. And look at how the pyramid has begun to get more crowded here as more digital activity starts coming into play. I made some big arrows here on a couple of areas that really began to pop. Streaming video, 56% already were watching streaming video in 2006, 2007 on a weekly basis or more often. And then something called social networking really began to move into the mainstream. And as you can see here, 44% of our overall Techsurvey sample of rock radio had a social media profile, at least somewhere. And who was the big dog at that time? Yeah, it was MySpace, right? MySpace owned social media back in 2006, 2007. Something called Facebook was bubbling way under back then, behind classmates.com, which we categorized as a social network. You can see reunion.com and Friendster are in there as well. Obviously, video was happening in a big way as YouTube came into being about the year before, but a lot of people were watching videos on MySpace as well. Where's Facebook? Not even in the hunt. We'll show you updated information about that. And of course, we know how much video we're watching on Facebook these days. So now it's 2008, Techsurvey number 4, 69 stations, 27,000 respondents, and a big finding for us. And that's that people are beginning to use their cell phones as alarm clocks. This is a big deal. Over half of those who had a cell phone at this time, 2008, already were using the alarm clock feature in their phones. And so we know what they weren't using, right? They weren't using the clock radio on the nightstand. So this was really the beginning of that trend. The other beginning trend was the iPhone. And again, only 3% of the overall sample had one at this point. It was still very much bubbling under, but we knew there was something going on with this device. And this is when we actually started tracking it by brand. But really the big deal at this time was iPods. And now we have 4 years of Techsurvey tracking, and you can see how iPods became so hugely popular back in that mid part of the previous decade here. By 2008, almost 6 of every 10 respondents already had an iPod or similar device. All right, 2009, 64 stations participating, 21,000 respondents, and now the pyramid is really beginning to get crowded here because so much new technology is coming into the forefront. The 3 areas that I want to draw your attention to, and you can see the bar on the right that indicates the percentage change from the year before. And so the 3 top gainers in 2008, 2009 were texting, right? Remember in that very first pyramid, only about a quarter of the sample were texting on a weekly basis. Well, now we're up to 63%. Social media now, that didn't even really exist when we started Techsurvey. Now a majority of our respondents, 51%, use social media, and streaming beginning to come into its own. 39% listening to internet audio, internet radio on a weekly basis or more often. And here I've isolated out, we did back then, the 5-year trend now on streaming. And as you can see, a steady uptick from year to year to year. What were people streaming back in 2009? Well, up on top there, you can see the 3-year trend. These are core radio listeners, and so a lot of them were actually streaming the station that sent them the survey on a computer, as well as radio stations in the area and from around the country. But whoops, notice the black arrow there for Pandora. You can begin to see the early growth there of Pandora, really the first product of its kind in the marketplace, and it was already up to 20% usage among those who streamed at all Pandora was clearly something that we were keeping a very close eye on. This was also the first year that Facebook passed MySpace, and of course, never looked back. But this is when it happened in 2009. And we were still tracking classmates.com. Note that LinkedIn was at 9%. And look all the way down at the bottom. Yep, that's good old Twitter, which was just beginning to come online in a big way in 2009. We started recognizing what was going on in the car back then as well. And so we asked people who were planning on buying or leasing a new car in 2009, what were the must-have features? So as has been the case forever, AM/FM radio, as you can see, a strong number one. Back then, 8 of every 10 new car buyers or lessees wanted a CD player, right? That was a big feature. But here's the big finding, is that almost half already knew that the technology existed to be able to plug in an iPod into the dashboard. And this really was a game changer for the car that we started tracking very, very carefully. All right, Techsurvey 6, it's now 2010. Hey, we're up to 78 stations, 26,000 plus respondents. Some great findings here, especially in the streaming department. And move your eyes down there to that red arrow. You can see that Pandora is really on a tear now with huge streaming growth among rock radio listeners from year to year. So Pandora was beginning to flip out some radio companies and some radio owners. And so we started looking for negatives about Pandora among those who actually use the platform. And look all the way up on top, people were really happy at the beginning. They had no problems with Pandora. There were some complaints about a lack of song skips, and a few people missed disc jockeys, or the lack of local information, or that it kind of gets a little boring or stale. But as you can see, a plurality of Pandora users had absolutely no complaints whatsoever. So meanwhile, the smartphone is beginning to become much more mainstream, especially among younger respondents. As you can see, 4 of every 10 of whom at this point already have a smartphone. And now Apple, just like Facebook did over MySpace, has passed BlackBerry. Android is still very, very new at this point. You can see they're down in 4th place with only 11%. That would not last long. And in fact, BlackBerry, this is as high as they would ever get again before they completely faded out. But this was the first year that iPhone actually passed everyone to become the #1 smartphone brand. Apps also started becoming a big deal, and of smartphone owners, now you can see that 8 of every 10 have downloaded either free or paid apps, which was obviously the vast majority of smartphone owners. Clearly, apps were much more readily used in smartphones than skills are today in smart speakers. But people understood what apps were all about. And in fact, we actually zoomed in on those who had downloaded apps, and we saw that a lot of people were listening to apps like Pandora. 40% of smartphone owners who downloaded apps already had an app like Pandora or Pandora on their phones. And you can see the blue slices were apps for broadcast radio stations, whether they were aggregated apps like iHeartRadio or apps for individual stations, which is what we were now making a lot of at Jake Apps at that time. Well, one of the cool things about Techsurvey is that you've got so many respondents, you can ask them all kinds of interesting questions. And so we started asking about Christmas music listening. Now remember, these are all still rock listeners here. This is before we expanded out to 14 different formats. So we're still looking at rockers here. And interestingly, 1/5 of our rock sample had listened to Christmas music at least half the time in the previous December. And these studies were being done in January and February. So people's memories were very good. And this is really when we began to see Christmas music really coming into its own. Here's Tech Survey number 7. This was a good one, 75 stations participating, 21,000 plus respondents. This was the year we got a little infographics crazy. Infographics started becoming very popular, and we went a little over the top here, as you'll see in a moment. So we now have some really good trending on social media, and you can see that when you look at Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, they're all going up every year. But look at the outlier in the bottom left. Yeah, this is the sign of a real problem here. By this point, Rupert Murdoch had already bought MySpace, and as you can see, things were not going swimmingly at this point, as MySpace was in the process of going away. Android now is beginning to move in a major way, passing BlackBerry like it's standing still, as well as all the other fledgling brands of smartphones at this point, Palm phones, Windows phones, and a few others floating around there. This is where you could really see it becoming a 2 operating system race, and that is exactly where we have ended up today. Well, look at texting. These hands are kind of weird, aren't they? But there's no really disguising the amazing trend in texting. Back in the early years, there were stations kind of experimenting with texting, but obviously there wasn't enough scale there, not enough listeners actually texting on a regular basis. Now we're looking at daily texting here above the 60% mark. And off to the right, you can see that depending on the format, especially for alternative fans, texting was becoming a mainstream way of communicating. Tech Survey 8 was the breakout. This is the year that we actually were able to put it together and collect data for a ton of different formats. Have Joel Denver to thank for that. He was the guy that pushed me into doing this, and it really turned out to be a great decision. We had 170 radio stations take part, 57,000 plus respondents, and it was great. We were able to actually develop data by format, and this was the first survey of its kind that ever did that. And in fact, Tech Survey is the only survey of its kind that provides format level data. Why is that so important? Well, we know that content is king. We only hear that 11 times a day by just about everybody. But what we have come to understand is that while content is critically important to any brand, so is distribution. Distribution is queen if indeed content is king. And when you can actually start looking at your own audience by format, and by discrete listeners themselves, you can really learn a lot about where to invest your money and your human resources as well. So all of a sudden now we've got formats that we had never seen before in Tech Survey. Here's mainstream AC. This was when Groupon started taking off, and so we started measuring it as well. But when you look at this pyramid for mainstream AC, you can really see the areas that are critically important that radio stations needed to cover. And then as you get kind of near the top of the pyramid, certainly the recommendation would be for mainstream AC not to really bother with Twitter at this point, right? Only 15% of mainstream AC listeners actually were on Twitter. So this is where the format level data really became important in terms of helping to make distribution decisions. Here's country, right? Different format, different set of circumstances, and different usage patterns. And so to this day, this is how programmers are actually using Tech Survey strategically to be able to really help them make better spending and resource-oriented decisions. Ever seen this guy before? It's Clayton Christensen. He is a Harvard professor, and he's famous for the jobs to do philosophy. His philosophy is that people actually hire brands to do a job for them. So the question is, what are people hiring radio to do, especially with all this new technology floating around? I mean, when you listen to radio stations, it sounds like what people are hiring stations to do is to hear a lot of commercial-free country music, or win tickets to concerts, but that's not really the main reason why people listen to the radio, especially in this environment. And so in this study, we actually went back to the well to try and find out how radio was really holding up with all this technology. And what we did was we gave our respondents a list of possible reasons why they enjoyed listening to AM/FM radio, and we had them tell us what were the main drivers, the main reasons why they love to listen to radio. So yes, another pyramid, look all the way down at the bottom, and yep, favorite music, number 1, mentioned by a majority of respondents. Personalities, number 2, again, not a surprise, but then we move into the emotional benefits of listening to the radio. I hire radio to be a companion with me at work. I hire radio to help me get in a better mood when things aren't going very well. I hire radio to keep me company. I hire radio for escape. These emotional benefits that started popping from Techsurvey were things that we continue to ask about and expand on today, because it's critically important for radio listeners to know what it is their audiences truly value about their brands, their programming, and everything in between. Well, when you can look at formats, you can really do some amazing stuff. So the weird little bar there in the middle with all the old Jacobs Media logos represents the average for any question that you see. So in this case, 52% back in Techsurvey 8 of our respondents had a smartphone when this survey was taken. But you look to the left and you can see that smartphone ownership was a lot higher back then among fans of alternative, top 40, CHR, rock, and sports. And then looking all the way on the right, you can see the laggard formats when it comes to smartphone ownership. They're classic rock, Christian radio. We still hadn't done our own Christian survey, so they were right there with all the other formats. And then adult contemporary. So again, a lot of data now at a format level. And one of the things that we learned here in Techsurvey is the importance of word of mouth. And that word of mouth really does vary quite a bit depending on who you're talking about. And so from the very beginning, we started including the Net Promoter question. We did not invent this, sadly, because if we had, we would definitely be absolutely in the pink on an island somewhere in the South Pacific. All the big boys measure their word of mouth with this question. So it goes like this: on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 means extremely likely and 0 means not at all likely, how likely are you to recommend the radio station that sent you this survey to a friend, family member, or coworker? And it's a really high bar. As you can see, promoters are 9s and 10s, that's it. Anything below a 9 is not a promoter, and detractors are 0s through 6s. So you look down at the bottom there and you can see the formula. You take your 9s and 10s, your promoters, you subtract the 0s through 6s, the detractors, and you come up with a net promoter score. So here it was now by all these different formats, and you can see that the average for all the stations in Techsurvey was about a 42. By the way, in the most recent Techsurvey from this year, it's 44. So it hasn't really moved all that much, but look all the way to the left there. There's Christian radio just completely blowing past all the different formats. And it was about at this point where we started to realize that Christian radio should be in its own survey. It's a different business model in many different ways from commercial radio. And so we eventually moved them out. But as you can see, with the Net Promoter Score over 70, very impressive, followed by country distantly, and then classic rock. So a great measure of word of mouth. All right, well, now we're up to Techsurvey 9, and we're beginning to figure this out. And it's becoming clearer and clearer to us that generations are a big part of the way that we think about audience. And so I think we were really the first of these radio surveys out there to begin to start looking at our samples generationally. Now, this is brand new data this year from Nielsen. And one of the things that ought to jump out at you here is that there's almost as many millennials as there are baby boomers. The other thing that you'll notice is that millennials are not children. They are 22 to 38 years old. That's a big chunk of that 25 to 54 target that everybody is going after. So millennials are very much in the mainstream, but don't look now. Nielsen charts 77 million Gen Zs, people between the ages of 3 and 21, the next up and coming generation. And so that's another reason why Techsurvey is important, to understand the generational relationships. Here's the way it looked back in Techsurvey 9. Again, I think this is probably a pretty good reflection of the radio broadcasting industry here. The biggest segment are boomers. We have a very, very similar share of Gen Xers and millennials, and Gen Z, not big broadcast radio listeners or survey filler outers, and so you can see a small percentage there. But this is when we were able to now start making pyramids based on generations. So here are baby boomers. And so this is very, very helpful from a targeting and planning standpoint to be able to actually look at these generational trends. So boomers and then millennials. And notice how the bars got a lot wider there, because these younger listeners are just so much more media active. And I put some gold stars next to a number of the areas where millennials blow past the rest of the sample, right? Texting, Facebook usage, smartphone ownership, tablet ownership, Twitter usage, Pandora was way up there at that time as well. So this became very helpful. The other thing that we started asking about was we started isolating respondents who told us they were listening to less AM/FM radio from the year before, and we wanted to find out, well, what's the problem? If you say you're listening to less radio, what really explains that erosion? So look all the way down at the bottom, and most people who were actually listening less said, hey, it has nothing to do with what's on the radio. It has everything to do with a lifestyle change. Maybe I changed jobs, or I graduated, or I moved, or I retired. So obviously we can't do anything about that. But notice what the next two problems were, what we call unforced errors, right? People who said, you know what, I'm just not enjoying the programming that I hear on broadcast radio, and almost an equal number pointing at too many commercials. Then we begin to move into what we called here the tyranny of choice. iPods, Pandora, satellite radio, mobile, internet, you name it. And so we track this every year in Techsurvey 2. It really is important to know the positives and the negatives. Well, we called them digital dashboards back then. Only 11% of our respondents actually drove a car at this point with a system like Ford's Sync or Toyota's Entune. This was still very early days in the connected car space. But look all the way to the left, and you could see that it was fans of country, news talk, sports, CHR, rock, and AC who were leading the league at that time. Doesn't look like that today, but it looked like that in the early years. And so you've seen this question before. This is trending from 2012 to 2013, the most important new car features among prospective new car buyers, and AM/FM radio, solid as a rock, right? Very, very good. But we begin to see some serious growth here in the number of car buyers who want an iPod connector, who want Bluetooth, who are beginning to understand that connectivity in the car is something they can have. And then bubbling under, you see satellite radio, Wi-Fi, the overall infotainment system, and even HD radio All of these are smaller numbers, but you can see they're all growing. And this was also the year that we did a much deeper dive into social media beyond Facebook. So here's 2012, the most popular social media sites among the previous year's study. Again, Facebook, the big leader, followed by LinkedIn, and then Twitter. And here's the trending for the new year, 2013. Facebook getting even bigger. They're all pretty much getting bigger, except for, yeah, these guys. Now MySpace is really in a world of hurt here, being passed by pretty much everybody. Twitter also showing some significant growth from year to year, as was Pinterest and Google+. Instagram, this was the first year we included them. And as you can see, not a bad breakout first year. Of course, Instagram now a major player. And look all the way down at the bottom, there was something called Snapchat. We sort of threw it in at the very last moment, kind of a bubbling under social media platform. But that's the beauty of these surveys. It gives us an opportunity to find out whether gadgets, devices, platforms are going to make it, are going to score if you track the data year after year. Remember, we had talked about Pandora earlier. What's the problem with Pandora? Well, here's the way it looked in 2012. The biggest complaints were not enough song skips and the absence of people. But by 2013, Pandora started playing more commercials. And Pandora listeners picked up on it. And as you can see up there on top, in a very big way. And ultimately, this was probably a big part of Pandora's undoing. Ultimately, is that they were not able to really integrate commercial advertising in a seamless, positive kind of way. Of course, those of us in radio know how that game is played. Well, we called Techsurvey 10 back in 2014 the digital tipping point. And in fact, you'll see why that was. 37,000 respondents, almost 200 radio stations, and we're obviously measuring multi-formats and multi-generations here. Now 19% are up to connected car ownership, so it's becoming a bigger deal. Sports fans, number one, tied with those who were fans of variety hits. So again, something we've continued to watch. Something that we did for the very first time in Techsurvey 10 was to ask our respondents to think back to a typical week and how they listened to the station that sent them the survey. And we listed all the different platforms that they could use to consume their favorite station's content. And we asked them to assign a percentage to each one. And so here's the very first pie chart that we generated. And you can see the biggest slice of consumption for radio station fans was listening to the station that sent them the survey on a regular radio in a vehicle of some kind. 51% of consumption. The second consumption point was people listening to a regular radio at home, work, or school. That was 29% of consumption. And so you can add those together. And you can see in the bottom right, that's what traditional listening is. That's 80%. 17% though is digital. And you can see that on this part of the screen here, the 10% of consumption back at Techsurvey 10 was listening to the station stream on a computer. Mobile apps were in play and podcasts were just beginning to come on. So this is a question that we ask every year. We'll show you trending in a moment. Here was an agree-disagree question that we added in when Lori Lewis was working for us, because the idea was to see if there really was a connection between a radio station's social interaction with its audience and listening. So the agree-disagree statement is, I find myself listening more to stations that interact with me socially. And as you can see, 3 out of every 10 respondents agree or agree strongly with that statement. And when you actually look at the formats that really resonate here, you can see up there at the top, it's CHR, country, hot AC, alternative, and rock. But again, all of these, even on the bottom side of this chart, were very important. This was a big piece of learning for us. And here it is demographically. You can see that women respond better to social interaction, as do progressively younger listeners. The other big finding that we hit on in Tech Survey 10 was realizing that it was one thing to actually have a profile on a social media platform. It was another thing about how often you actually use that platform. So here you're looking at what we now refer to as social media cume, right? These are all the platforms that social media users are on the most. Facebook, 95% of those with a social media profile were on Facebook back then, 56% LinkedIn, 51% Twitter, and so on. You'll notice MySpace apparently still sort of hanging in, 28% saying that they actually had a profile at Tech Survey 10. But I'll show you when we actually look at time spent socializing, those who actually use these platforms daily or even more often. And here's why Facebook became such the big dog. Not only was just about everybody who was involved in social media on Facebook, but of them, 3/4 used Facebook on a daily basis. And this basic relationship continues to exist today. Now, the only other two social media platforms with respectable daily usage were Twitter and Instagram. And oh, by the way, remember that 28% who still had a MySpace profile? Well, they were telling us the truth. They had the MySpace profile. They just never visited MySpace anymore. We wanted to find out how people use Facebook and Twitter differently. And so here we've isolated out Facebook users. We've given them a whole list of possible reasons why they enjoy Facebook. And you can see what Facebook really is all about, connecting with friends and family. Twitter, on the other hand, was more about following people of interest, not so much connecting with family members. Of course, this turned out to be true. One of our other big findings had to do with frequent sharing. You can see the question at the bottom left of the screen. How often do you share things with friends, family members, and others that you see on websites, social media platforms, or that you receive in emails? And back in Tech Survey 8-9 days, sharing was kind of modest, right? 13 to 17%. And all of a sudden in Tech Survey 10, it doubles. It goes up to 34%. And we were a little flipped out when we saw these numbers, like, wow, could this really be happening? You can see that sharing is much more prevalent among women and millennials. But we were a little concerned about this when we first saw the data because it was such a huge leap. Turned out to be true. And I'll show you that in a moment. Here's a new question that we actually use to this day. Agree, disagree. I am addicted to my mobile phone. And as you can see, a significant percentage of our respondents actually admitted to their addiction. Women, much more honest. Same with members of Gen Z and millennials. And of course, smartphone owners down there as well. We continue to track this, and not surprisingly, addiction continues to be a smartphone issue. Tech Survey 11, and this was the year we created a second pyramid. So the first pyramid now was all about broad media usage. Do you have a smartphone? Are you on social media? Do you stream? And so you can see what the pyramid looked like back in 2015 for Tech Survey 11. Obviously, technology is exploding at this point. This is the year we first started asking about a smart TV, internet connected television. 4 of every 10 already there. But at this point, 8 of every 10 respondents own a smartphone, and even more than that are involved with social media and texting. But the second pyramid was all about brands, because we really felt that it was important to separate brands from those broader areas. So this was the very first brand pyramid that we created. There's radio down there at the bottom. And then all of these others, for the most part, are weekly usage. So look at where Facebook comes in. 7 of every 10 respondents say they use Facebook on a weekly basis or more often. But take a look at both YouTube and Netflix, streaming video platforms that are really beginning to get popular back in 2015, especially Netflix. So this pyramid has really become important for us because we can really see how different audiences use different brands. And this is a fun pyramid. We've got millennials on the left and baby boomers on the right. And so when you look at the brands that millennials use quite a bit more than boomers, and we have a lot of little Mark Zuckerbergs here, sort of a millennial symbol, if you will, to designate all the areas where millennials outdo their parents or grandparents. You can see there's a lot of them, right? Facebook, YouTube, look at Pandora there in the middle, Instagram, right? Not even close. Now, when we look at brands that baby boomers frequent more than millennials, it's good old John Lennon, and it really is only LinkedIn and Sirius XM satellite radio. Everything else is all about millennials. This has become an important statement here. We track this every year. One of radio's primary advantages is its local feel. 8 of every 10 agree with this statement. And the really remarkable thing about the demographics here is how unremarkable they really are. We have consistency across all these different demographics. A new question in Techsurvey 11, would you be willing to register in order to listen to your favorite station stream? This is all about accountability here, and the importance of getting that information, like a zip code, email address, and name from those who use our stream. The good news is 2/3 have no problem with this, especially rhythmic CHR fans, and then you can see it begin to start sliding down with AAA classic rock and rock. Well, remember that finding early on about how cell phone users were using their phones to wake up instead of the alarm? Well, we started actually asking specifically, how do you wake up in the morning? And as you can see here now, mobile phones way in the lead. And when we kind of add them all up, this was the year that mobile phones actually caught clock radios. We have a tie, 40% on each side of the spectrum. By the way, mobile now is way out in front. And you can really see that illustrated on this chart. Here are the generations that use a clock radio to wake up. And you can see there's clearly a definite lean toward boomers and those born in 1946 or earlier, the silent generation. And then when you look at those who actually wake up to their phones, boom, you really see the millennials leading the way here. Techsurvey number 12, 245 stations, 39,000 plus respondents. And now we're beginning to get concerned about radios where people live. Now remember, these are core radio listeners, and fewer than 9 in 10 actually have a working AM/FM radio where they live. And look at millennials, right? The numbers are quite a bit lower than that. In fact, the younger you are, the less likely that you have a radio where you live. Remember, we were concerned back in Techsurvey 10 about that huge jump in frequent sharing. Well, as you can see, it was a trend. It was not a blip at all. And you can definitely see how sharing is so important to radio, making sure that our content is readily available, easily and seamlessly shared wherever we post it. You've seen this before, except what's going on here is that traditional listening to our stations continues to go down. From Techsurvey 11 to Techsurvey 12, traditional now is down 81 to 77. Digital now is up 17 to 20. I'll show you a trender in just a moment on that. What about on demand? Well, this is where we began to discover the connection between video on demand and audio on demand. Take a look at this. We asked people what percentage of their overall TV viewing is on demand. And as you can see, for some people, it really is on the high side here. 48% of our sample say that half or more of all their TV or video viewing is now on demand. Women more than men, but look at the age trajectory there by generation. No question that this is a generational thing. And when you look all the way down at the bottom, monthly podcast listeners are also more likely to watch video on demand, hence that connection between video on demand and audio on demand. Here it is from the other side of the street. Look up on top here, 20% of our overall sample listens to podcasts on a weekly basis or more often. Obviously, again, you can see the generational skew here. The younger you are, the more into podcasting you are. But then these are people who actually use Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, and Amazon Prime on a weekly basis. And look how big their podcasting numbers actually are. So this really is the solidification, if you will, of that relationship between video on demand and audio on demand. And that's why we're so bullish on podcasting, because we know video on demand has really taken over, and we know it floats over to the audio space. Podcasting, it's addictive. Among those who listen to podcasts monthly or more often, in the past year, 27% say they've actually been listening to more podcasts. And you can't be at all surprised by these generational numbers. They totally fit into what we've been seeing all along. This is the first year we actually asked about preferred podcast categories. And not surprisingly, because so many radio stations repurpose morning shows and other programming, that's the most popular category with our overall sample, followed by news, current events, and politics, and then comedy, sports, music, and pop culture. But the cool thing is we can look at this by format and by discrete audiences here. And so here's alternative. And you would think maybe that music would be number one for all fans, but in fact, it's comedy that's up on top. So again, this is a big part of the learning process. This was the first year we asked our respondents to think about a typical day in the car. What do they actually listen to while they are on four wheels? Radio has a 66 share of in-car media usage. Number one, as you can see, over everything else. Satellite radio and personal music tied with around a 10% share. And then in single digits are things like Pandora and talking books and podcasts. But when you isolate those who have a connected car with so many more possibilities, watch what happens when we look at their in-car media usage. Keep your eye peeled on the AM/FM slice of the pie. Precipitous drop from 66 to 55%. And look who the big winner is, satellite radio. And we think that part of the reason why is that in the car, it is as easy to discover, tune in, and preset satellite radio stations as it is broadcast radio stations. Something else that we learned in Techsurvey 12 was about presets on in-car systems. And what we found out, as you can see here, that almost 8 of every 10 rarely or never change their presets once they are set up. And so this becomes really important as people are buying connected cars that are so much more complicated. And if that orientation isn't really great from the beginning, it can really cause some major problems in listening to our radio station. So this is another reason why we've spent so much time talking to car dealers, the people who actually orient buyers to what is going on in their connected cars. And this is just one of those, kind of interesting questions, but we see vinyl records coming back. And so the question is an agree-disagree statement. I regularly listen to vinyl records. And you can see about 14% of the overall sample do. Leaning male, look at millennials there. We've seen this in some other research as well. Millennials really like that tactile idea of albums and books, by the way. So you can really see that here. Here's a gaming system ownership. This is something else that we are continuing to track. and it's going to dovetail into esports in the coming survey, but 45% of our sample here owns a video game system, and you can see, not surprisingly, that leans heavily millennial and Gen X. So last year, Techsurvey 13, this was a really big one for us with some great findings. And you know, you think back to what it is about the radio that people really value. This is something that we had never thought to ask before, but as we find out, almost 6 of every 10 people say they like to listen to broadcast radio because it's free, no subscription fee. And look who really leads from everybody else, Gen Z and millennials, those who are actually spending money on Spotify, Netflix, and everything else. So this is one of those stealth benefits for radio that a lot of people don't realize. Well, you've seen this before. This is the station listening platform now, traditional listening on regular radios now for all these stations in Techsurvey, down to 74%, digital 22%. When we actually go back now and look at the trending line going all the way back 5 years here, you can really see how traditional listening in red has continued to go down and digital listening has continued to go up. And so this is not a revelation, but certainly confirmation that the digital usage of our brands continues to be important. What devices or platforms do people use to stream our radio stations? Well, the website is still number 1, but the station app is a very, very strong number 2. And then come platforms like iHeart, TuneIn, and others. This is the first year we asked about cord cutting. And as you can see, 12% tell us they used to be pay TV subscribers, but no longer. And not a shock, right? But again, millennials really leading the way. Podcasting last year really beginning to come on. And you can see that here again, especially with our millennial audience. Now, 1/5, 21% are listening to podcasts on a weekly basis or more often, but that's 1/3 of millennials. So we're asking more questions about podcasting because it's such a big topic. In fact, what are people doing while they are actually listening to podcasts? So here's the pecking order from last year's survey. Yeah, and this is the first year we actually start to ask about smart speakers. And so the debut percentage is 11%. And what was interesting about the demographics here is really how even they are on a brand new device, which we know new devices and gadgets tend to start out young and then eventually older generations figure it out. That really isn't as much the case here with smart speakers, but a good debut at 11%. We also started asking about how often you use any voice command feature on devices you own, whether it's your phone or your car. And look at that, 1/5 say frequently, 1/4 say occasionally. Here's the frequentlies. And note that if you have a smart speaker, chances are even greater, in fact, twice as great, that you are regularly, frequently using voice commands. Here's a mobile phone addiction a couple of years later, and now a whopping 41% say, yep, I am addicted to my phone. And once again, millennials in the lead. Most important new car features, AM, FM hanging in there very well, but so are all the other secondary Bluetooth smartphone connectors. Look how much desirability there is for them. And the car is so important to radio. We ask all of our respondents on an average weekday, how much of your total broadcast radio time takes place in a car? 1/5 say all of it, 1/3 say most of it. You add that up, it's 50% of all respondents saying all or most of their radio listening time takes place in a car. And that's especially true with the younger end of the audience. Remember, many of them don't have a radio at home. The car is the only time they actually listen to the radio. There's something going on here between Spotify and Pandora, and you can see that Pandora continues to have the lead last year and this year, but when we actually broke it down by generations, you really begin to see the flip. And look at Gen Z. That's where Spotify has really taken off and really hurt Pandora in a serious way. Here's video streaming, Techsurvey 12 to Techsurvey 13. YouTube kind of getting flattish here, but look who's made the big move. There's Facebook, which is really focused on video, and that's why so many radio stations have moved over to Facebook for video streaming. A new question here, we've got to find out about e-commerce. During the holiday season, how much of your gift shopping was online? 7% say all of it was. A third say most of it was. Boy, that's huge, right? 60% of the audience say half or more of their holiday shopping a year ago was online. And again, not a surprise. The younger you are, the greater the likelihood you are into shopping on your phone or by your computer. But these are really big numbers across the entire spectrum. And then finally, this year's Techsurvey. And we really were able to get at some critically important issues this year. I'm not going to stop on these pyramids, but just so you know, here they are. Here's the regular media pyramid, and you can see just how built out it has become. Look all the way up on top. 1 in 10 people have a smartwatch now. We're expecting some growth in 2019. Stripe I just put up shows last year's data. And so this is how you really learn about your audience. We make these pyramids for all formats and all generations. Here's the brand pyramid. One of the big findings from this year's study is how stout, how strong video streaming brands are. Netflix, YouTube,